Thank you very much. May we then move on to the next item, which is item 5, on the consolidated 2014/15 financial report, month 2. Paul.
Thank you. Not much to add to Barbara's comments about the planning, and inevitably the finances are the end product of the planning and the consequence of all the things that have been described. And not much greatly to say about month 2, because as those of you who have been with the NHS for any length of time will know, by month 2 you know virtually nothing about the year, because there is very little data coming through in the first month or so. So maybe just to bring to a kind of conclusion the various discussions about risk that we've just talked about. As we know, we exited last year with an 800 million surplus, but it was 400 million less surplus than we went into last year with. So already in last year's performance, we saw the seeds, if you like, of many of the challenges that we've got this year, and specialised commissioning being the biggest one of those. That pattern's absolutely reflected in the plans that you have in front of you described. Significant challenges we've been facing. I don't think I've ever been quite this late in the year without a set of plans which are all kind of laid to rest and ready to be acted upon. And that, I think, is just an indication of the difficulties around the country different health economies have been facing, and it's not just in specialised commissioning, in other parts of the forest as well. So at the time of writing the paper, you'll see that there is 137 million of effectively lower surplus being planned by the various parts of the organisation than we need to deliver this year. To put it another way, we have 400 million of drawdown of prior year surpluses available to us. This plan would have implied that we needed 537, and there is no source of additional money that we can fall back on for that. Just need to put that in context, of course. That's about 0.1% of our total budget. So sometimes we can, I think, slightly overstate the significance of what we're doing. That is a very, very small very small difference, but one that we have needed to resolve. I am pleased to say that not only in specialised, as Barbara said, but in terms of the CCG position, we have now resolved how we're going to close that gap. I'm expecting plans over the next few days from the very small number of organisations who weren't previously fulfilling the expectation that we wouldn't draw down CCG surpluses in aggregate in 14-15, and that we would seek to keep any deficits that were inevitably the case at the level they were in 13-14, rather than allowing those to increase. There were about 18 organisations around the country who, CCGs that is, whose plans didn't fulfil that pattern, and we should, by the end of this week or early next week, have plans in which will close that gap. That will enable us at last to move beyond a planning cycle which has seemed to go on forever, and into the much more important piece of work that we now have to do, which is delivering against those plans. It is inevitably the case that this is the riskiest set of plans we've had for a while. So last year at this time of the year, there was a large proportion of the drawdown available to us which we had not allocated. It was ready to cover risks as they arose during the year. We needed some of it led to a slightly higher surplus at the end of last year than we had anticipated. This year, all of that drawdown, all of the 400 million of money from previous years, has had to be allocated in coming to the plans that we've talked about. So there isn't some kind of central place to which we can go for risk mitigation as we go through. And as we've talked about, and I'll highlight in a moment, there are a number of areas of risk that we will be encountering as the year goes by. So we've got all of the standard things. We've got contingencies in place, 0.5% across the piece, as has always been the case in the NHS. We've got, particularly in CCGs, a substantial proportion of the 2% that we like them to put aside for non-recurrent purposes and transformation. So we have some risk mitigation, but it is very limited and none of it held centrally. So that really means that we're going to have to focus a lot of attention on the risk assessment and the mitigation assessment that we do. You'll be aware that as part of the Management Information Pack that we discussed with the Finance and Investment Committee at length, and which I bring to you as the board in summarised form, we have each month, when we do the forecast, also the risks and mitigations against that. And I'm going to suggest that we spend a bit more time as the year goes by looking at that particular set of analyses so that we can act quickly when things are looking tight. The two obvious things, one of which we've just discussed at length and therefore I won't repeat, which sit at the top of my mind as being the risk factors in all of this, are specialised commissioning. I say we've discussed that at length. The other one is the trends which Simon talked about in the beginning of this meeting, the emerging apparent trend, at least, of high levels of activity, particularly emergency activity, than we had last year and certainly than we had in the plan for this year. I think it's a bit early days yet to know how much of that is really going to translate into real trends on the ground and how much of that is an artefact of a couple of months of data in one form or another. As you can imagine, we're spending a lot of time getting under the skin of that and working out the answer to that question. But I'd have to sound a bit of a note of caution, which is if that starts to become a trend of any magnitude as the year goes by, that will start impacting on the financial risk in the system. I think that's probably as much as I wanted to say on it, Malcolm. It's fairly clear otherwise, I think, from the report.
I might just ask Paul if you could say a little for the board about the £2.1 billion of quick efficiency savings that are assumed in order to get to a balanced plan, because obviously that is a very substantial efficiency assumption. So talk a bit about the mode of delivery, the confidence that we have about the likelihood of that all being realised. And Barbara may want to add to that.
So I think it comes in two parts. So just to give it a bit of context, so we have a plan for 2.1. We had a plan for 13-14, which was, I think, about 50-60 million less than that, so around about 2-point-something billion. So the level of ambition in the plan is, I would say, to all intents and purposes, similar to what we had last year. As we know, we undershot the plan last year by about 15% in total. That left us about 300 million short, and if you want a simple way of saying what the risk is, if you like, around the quip, that would have to be it. We have been through an extensive piece of assurance with each of the CCG plans, which Barbara described briefly in her patch, to see the extent to which those quip plans have substance. The particular increases in the two parts of the country where we've struggled most in terms of financial delivery and quip delivery, being Midlands and East and the South, where there is more pressure on the system, I think, arguably from a financial perspective. It's worth saying the CCGs, despite under-delivering on quip last year, were able to deliver the financial bottom lines in aggregate that we did deliver last year, so they have mitigations for it. But I would say that the quip plans are as strong, if not stronger, this year than they were last year, and of course all the benefits of integrated care and the work we're doing in that area will start to feed through in the CCG plans. The much bigger concern I've got, to be frank, is the 100 million additional stretch in the specialised commissioning plans, which is part of that 2.1 billion that you talk about. That is round about 100 million more than we had in the quip delivery last year, and it's intrinsically tied up with whether we can start to have an impact on the level of growth in activity in specialised commissioning, which is running at an unaffordable rate for the scope of those services, and secondly, whether we can get a better grip than was the case last year on the basics of contracting and challenge of activity and all the rest of it, which will also be a part of that. So it is a big risk. I think we'd have to face that on the CCG side, more strength in the plans and probably greater mitigation if some of it doesn't quite translate into delivery. On the specialised commissioning front, big stretch and little mitigation if it doesn't work.
Ed?
Just to say, Maura and I have been through this in quite a lot of detail in the Finance and Investment Committee, and Paul and I have had a number of bilaterals, and I would say absolutely that there are greater risks in this plan. There is lower levels of contingency than I personally would like to see as a board member, but we are where we are on that. The only other point I would make is, it's the end of June. We need to get into a rhythm of having a balanced budget on the 1st of April rather than at the end of the first quarter. So I would hope that next year we can, notwithstanding the difficulties, and I know it's been massively complicated and difficult, and I'm sympathetic, but from a perspective of running the organisation, we ought to be able to do it for the start of the year. That's meant to be helpful, not unhelpful, and it's not a criticism of the challenges you've gone through this year.
Thank you. Other observations? Kieran?
Corollary to my other question, I suppose. Next year will be harder. We're still ageing as a population, etc. Is there enough change in the activity in the plan? Are we moving towards new models of care? Because the only way we get out of this, ultimately it isn't about financial planning and it isn't about sort of budgets. Ultimately it's about change on the ground.
Do you want to comment on the quip plans and change?
Sorry, I'm sorry, I just lost the drift.
Well, why don't
I'm really
I
sorry.
start off then,
Yeah.
Kieran? Because I think you're absolutely right, and I think there's a sense across the NHS that actually the more of the same is nearly run its course. There is still opportunity out there. We know there are still differences in efficiency in different parts of the health service, but the fact is people are up for something different, and so part of what we are going to be doing, as you know, between now and the autumn, as we work with partners to articulate a sort of 5-year forward view on the new types of clinical models, the different ways of working, how we will get there, is precisely to put flesh on the bones of, I think, the challenge that you have rightly laid out. So there is an appetite for that. There are new ways of working breaking out around the country, but often that is despite the system, not because of it. And our task is to identify what needs to change about both the level of local support and also the broader regulatory and commissioning superstructure, if you like, to actually ensure that that can come about.
No.
As I said, going into the year with no contingency on a budget of this scale is complex, to say the least. But I'm wondering, what's going on underneath the budget is that there is a run cost for the NHS, and then there is a change cost for the NHS, and both are rising. And that creates compression, clearly, in the budget system. And you'll have a view, Paul, on what the relative balance is between those two mega factors, if you like, and how they will change over time. But just looking beyond this financial year to some point of exit in the future, at what point do the run costs stabilise to the point where we're creating capacity in the system for investment in the change? Or is that
Not in our lifetime.
or is that a subject we should come back to at a later point, because it's a fairly complex.
It's a complex question, and it's one to which there isn't a short-term answer, which is a problem, because we've got to be doing the long-term things, and in a normal circumstance you want to be doing the long-term things when you've got lots of money to do it with. We've got to do the long-term things at a time when money is compressed.
Yeah.
And it is also fair to say that the system is very it's very lumpy in that sense. So there are parts of the country, there are individual organisations, individual CCGs who have got the financial capacity to make the change costs of these work and can potentially run a bit ahead with some of that. There are other parts of the country and parts of the portfolio, Special Ed being the obvious one, where they're just to keep up with the run costs, we've got people really struggling, and therefore their ability to do the very things which would get them to the point you've just described is severely impaired.
So both the moving targets is what
Yes.
you're saying.
Exactly right.
But there certainly isn't, Malcolm, if I may, any money sitting at the centre to support change, and people often assume, I think, in the system that they can apply for some funds, and that's, we have to find ways in which the whole organisation is committing to achieving those changes, but we need to dispel that idea that there's a pot of money in Paul's pocket to...
We absolutely need to dispel that idea, but we also need, as we think out over the next 3 to 5 years, to identify what kind of transformational capacity, both in terms of funding, in terms of other change support, is going to be required to get us to where we need to get to. Because I think, as we were saying in relation to Kieran's question, more of the same is not going to work. So therefore, to will the end is to will the means, and the means are going to have to be some kind of transformational resourcing and intervention.
Multi-year.
Yes.
Victor.
Yeah, I guess it relates to Kieran's point really, which is, I don't suppose there's an answer, but it's more about knowing the pace of the changes on the ground and whether they're accumulating sort of fast enough. It's not just that these changes are taking place and we're welcoming them and they're actually happening in spite of us. It's people actually seeing that they're carrying on doing what they've always done stuff. But it's having a sense of whether that is growing at a pace that allows us to make some decisions about well, is it are we still going to be here in 5 years' time with 2 or 3 people doing the right things, making the right changes that save money and improve patient care, or is it going to be, half the CCGs, or it's getting a sense of the pace of change?
Without being apocalyptic about it, my answer to you, Victor, would be if it is 2 or 3 people in 5 years' time, we won't actually
We're in
be
trouble.
here.
Yeah, I
because
agree.
the reality is that what we're currently doing is not sustainable, given the likely
And can I just follow that up by, it's almost the money to support the change, in my view, isn't as important as how we support the culture of change, which is much more about values and the culture stuff, which we rarely talk about here. But it does concern me that we do have a kind of structure, leadership academy and all that sort of stuff, and it's kind of aligning that around patient involvement, community engagement, so that they're meeting this single idea of getting accelerated change. And I don't have a sense of that, and it seems to me to be pretty critical.
Well,
It's more a statement than a question, but it just seems to be.
Tim, did you wish to?
Well, it was only just to say that when you look at other sectors, one of the challenges has been for the leadership to take a very big gulp when it starts to think about the level of investment that will be required to enable the sort of disruptive transformation that we're talking about. So the discontinuity issue is a really big one for us as a somewhat fragmented system. In other words, how much will it cost to go from here to there? There will need to be a level of investment in doing that, and that's quite a difficult challenge, I think.
Or shift in current
Yeah,
resourcing,
yeah.
Not just
Yeah.
in NHS England, but all the supporting bodies. 'Cause it's not so much whether we've got enough money, it's whether we're spending the money that we've got.
Yeah.
Well,
Right, well, on that uplifting note, Victor,
I think it's pretty uplifting.
I think, and before we move on to the next item, which is the performance report, I think we just have to summarise that although we've heard it every year, this really is, I think, an immensely serious and challenging time. The indicators that we've got are all that activity is rising and that costs are rising against activity. We need to find new ways of treating patients in different contexts, in different environments, and a further upstream investment in models of care. We spent some time yesterday informally thinking through of new models of care and new financial means of supporting them. But Victor's point, I think, is absolutely right, which is you don't try and steer a system simply by shifting sums of money around at the margins. The critical thing is the values and the behaviours and the cultures that need to change in order to be able to regenerate a model of care that's fit for the 21st century. So we will, Paul, be anxious, of course, to review regularly performance in year. We don't know whether some of the trends that you've identified and are identified in the next paper are short-term or longer-term and ingrained, but at the same time, we will do whatever we can to support CCGs and others in devising new models of care against the backcloth of probably the most stringent financial settlement that the NHS has seen in many years. Right.
Chairman, before you leave that item, Paul mentioned that there were a few reports outstanding, and I think we don't have another board meeting to approve the final report, so we'll probably need to delegate the approval.
Indeed. Well, we're picking that up with the Finance and Investment Committee on a monthly basis anyway. So yes, sorry, that's a very, very helpful reminder. So we were looking for the Finance and Investment Committee, once we've got the final plans in, to be able to, I'm not sure which verb to use now in the new structure, because approve is not quite the right word, but to endorse the sum of the planning, accept the planning numbers as our final plan. I think that's very helpful.
Okay, well, just before I move on, could I just reinforce something I said earlier, which is that the finance team have done an outstanding job in closing the accounts for last year, and with colleagues around the table in producing an annual report, which I think is very clear in understanding what the NHS in England has achieved in the last year against our mandate and our financial performance. This will be published after it's been laid before Parliament, but all I can do this morning, I think, is express once again on behalf of the board our grateful thanks to Paul and his team, to Ed and the Audit Committee, and in particular again to the CCGs. This has been an extraordinarily complex exercise, and it's quite remarkable that it has come in as efficiently and as swiftly as it has. Thank you.